Do you notice anything
merry.
different? Yeah? Ho, ho, ho.
Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford were together for 14 solid years. To the public, they looked steady, familiar, almost untouchable. But in 2024, everything fell apart, and the marriage quietly went down the drain. They split, went their separate ways, and the story seemed settled. Since then, we've heard Ruth's side. Her version shaped the narrative, filled the headlines, and defined how people viewed the breakup. Eamonn stayed silent. No interviews, no clarifications, no pushback, until now. At 66, Eamonn Holmes is finally speaking up, and what he's saying changes the tone of everything. It reframes how the breakup looks, and more importantly, how Ruth Langsford comes across in the aftermath. So what exactly did Eamonn Holmes say? And why did he wait this long to tell his side of the story? Join us as we get into all the details. Eamonn Holmes, the rise, the silence, and the side of the story you never heard. Long before the headlines, the breakups, and the carefully worded statements, Eamonn Holmes was just a Belfast schoolboy learning how to hold a room. He was educated at Holy Family Primary School, then St. Malachy's College, and later the Dublin College of Business Studies. Nothing about that path screamed celebrity. What it did suggest was discipline, routine, and an early comfort with structure. And that would matter later, because Holmes built his entire career on being dependable when everything else was live, unpredictable, and often chaotic. His first real break came in 1979 when he walked into Ulster Television as a young presenter and reporter on Farming Ulster. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't national, but it was real broadcasting. It taught him how to think on his feet and how to speak to people without performing at them. From there, he slid naturally into sports coverage, working alongside seasoned reporters and learning the mechanics of live television the hard way, through repetition and pressure. By 1982, Ulster Television trusted him enough to hand him the anchor's chair on Good Evening Ulster, their flagship news program. He was stepping into a role previously held by Gloria Hunniford, and it was a quiet but significant vote of confidence. Holmes wasn't just reading scripts anymore. He was shaping conversations, setting the tone, and becoming a familiar face in Northern Irish homes. He didn't limit himself to news. He hosted pageants, specials, and live events, proving he could move between serious and light without losing credibility. When he left Ulster Television in 1986 to join the BBC, it wasn't an escape, it was a promotion. In Manchester, he became part of Open Air on BBC One, broadcasting nationally and learning what it meant to speak to millions instead of thousands. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. In 1993, Holmes joined GMTV and helped launch its very first broadcast. Morning television is unforgiving. You're live, you're early, and you're expected to be sharp when the rest of the country is half awake. Holmes thrived there. He became part of people's routines, the voice that eased them into the day. Even when tensions surfaced behind the scenes, including a well-publicized falling out with Anthea Turner, he stayed put, grounded in the role. When he finally walked away from GMTV in 2005, he didn't do it quietly. He made it clear the show had drifted away from real news and leaned too heavily into celebrity fluff. That honesty followed him. 6 months later, Sky News brought him in to front Sunrise, and once again, Holmes settled into the rhythm of early mornings, rotating co-hosts but keeping the tone steady and conversational. Along the way, he became one of television's most versatile presenters. Snooker, darts, horse racing, tennis, quiz shows, panel shows, faith programs like Songs of Praise, game shows like Jet Set. He didn't chase prestige. He chased consistency. Even when he joined This Morning in 2006, Holmes leaned into what he did best, making live television feel unscripted but safe. That approach reached its peak when he began presenting alongside Ruth Langsford. On screen, they were easy, familiar, and believable. Together, they fronted shows like Gift Wrapped and Eamonn and Ruth, How the Other Half Lives, turning their real-life partnership into a television brand. For viewers, it felt natural. For Holmes, it became inseparable from how the public saw him. But behind the scenes, the industry was changing. In 2020, Holmes lost a tribunal case over his freelance status under IR 35 rules, a moment that forced him to publicly defend not just his contract, but his value. He described himself as one of the best live presenters in the country, and whether people agreed or not, the confidence was unmistakable. Radio had always been his other lane. From downtown radio in the late 80s to Radio 5 Live, Magic 105.4, Radio 2, and later Talk Radio, Holmes treated radio as a space where he could talk longer, dig deeper, and be less polished. It was where his opinions came through most clearly, and where audiences heard him without the filter of studio lights. By 2022, he had joined GB News, launching a breakfast show with Isabel Webster. He described it as a place where he felt appreciated again, where journalism came first, and where rules could be bent just enough to make the conversation real. And now, after decades of being the steady one, the reliable one, the man who rarely explained himself, Holmes is talking again. Not as a presenter reading headlines, but as a man finally stepping out from behind them. And once he does, the story doesn't move forward. It goes back to the part of his life that was always kept quiet, long before the cameras, the commentary, and the need to explain anything at all. Eamonn and Ruth, the private love story that couldn't survive the spotlight. Eamonn and Ruth's love story didn't begin as a public romance or a television pairing designed for audiences to fall in love with. It began quietly, deliberately, almost cautiously, at a time when both timing and restraint mattered more than excitement. When Eamonn Holmes met Ruth Langsford in 1997 through their mutual friend Sally Mean, there was no rush to define what they were or announce it to the world. Holmes had separated from his first wife, Gabrielle, 2 years earlier, and the decision was made early on to keep the relationship private. Not out of secrecy, but out of respect. And that choice, made long before cameras followed their every move, quietly set the tone for everything that followed. When they did start dating, the relationship stayed firmly out of public view. Years later, Langsford would look back on that period and explain that Holmes' insistence on privacy only deepened her feelings for him. She reflected that it revealed the kind of man he was, the kind of father he aimed to be, and the level of integrity he carried into his personal life. Far from making her feel hidden, it made her feel secure. 2 years passed before they finally went public, and by then, the relationship was already rooted in something solid. Life moved forward quickly after that. In 2002, they welcomed their son, Jack, a moment that quietly changed the center of their world. Langsford later revealed that she discovered she was pregnant just one day before her godson Charlie's christening. Holmes was away at the time, so she shared the news first with her best friend Sam, Charlie's mom. It was an intimate moment, shared in confidence, one of those life events that doesn't need witnesses to feel profound. She would later describe it as a very special moment together, even in Holmes's absence. By 2006, their personal and professional lives began to fully intertwine. 9 years into their relationship, Holmes joined Langsford on the Friday edition of This Morning. Langsford was already established on the show, having been part of it since 1999, quietly becoming its longest-serving presenter. Working side by side wasn't something they pretended was easy. Langsford openly acknowledged that working with your partner came with challenges, even as she admitted they managed it most of the time. As the years passed, they became one of daytime television's most recognizable partnerships. Together, they hosted Gift Wrapped, How the Other Half Lives, Lose a Stone in 4 Weeks, Eamonn and Ruth's 7-Year Itch, and Do the Right Thing. Their chemistry became part of their public identity, the line between marriage and brand slowly blurring. Holmes leaned into it with humor, once joking that leaving television simply wasn't an option because viewers wouldn't stand for it. At the time, it sounded playful. In hindsight, it felt like a commitment that went deeper than either of them realized. 13 years after they first met, and 5 years after Holmes's divorce from Gabrielle was finalized, they married at Elvetham Hall in Hampshire. Soon after, they bought a 6-bedroom house in Weybridge, Surrey, reportedly worth £3.2 million. It looked like the final piece clicking into place: stability, success, permanence. Speaking years later on Strictly Come Dancing, Langsford described a marriage built on understanding. Holmes, she explained, was the first to tease her, and just as quickly, the first to surprise her with thoughtfulness. Even when she was consumed by the demands of the competition, she trusted that he understood her completely. That, she believed, was why they worked. Then came 2020, and with it, a shift neither of them seemed prepared for. In November, Holmes and Langsford were abruptly dropped from This Morning, replaced by Alison Hammond and Dermot O'Leary. The decision left them furious. Professionally, it was a blow. Personally, it marked the beginning of a clear divide. Langsford remained with ITV, continuing her presence on Loose Women. Holmes moved in a different direction entirely, joining GB News to host a breakfast show. For the first time in years, their careers were no longer aligned, and the distance between them was no longer just professional. By May 2024, the carefully maintained silence had finally broken. Holmes and Langsford confirmed that their marriage was over and that they were in the process of divorcing. A spokesperson explained that work commitments had taken their marriage in different directions. The message was calm, controlled, and carefully worded. They were determined to stay friends. They wanted to keep things amicable, and an official statement was promised for their fans. But behind the carefully worded statements sat the end of a relationship that had once been built on patience, privacy, and shared purpose. And behind that ending sat something else too. Something that had been wearing them down long before the marriage finally gave way. Because while the split was explained in calm language and professional terms, the truth is, the pressure had already been building quietly. Inside the one place Eamonn Holmes couldn't outrun: his own body. Eamonn Holmes, the pain that didn't end when the cameras cut. For years, the audience saw strength. What they didn't see was how much of that strength was borrowed. Behind the familiar voice and steady on-screen presence, Eamonn Holmes was fighting a body that was beginning to fail him piece by piece. But through it all, Ruth Langsford stood firmly at his side, offering support, reassurance, and optimism. But now, as their marriage comes to an end and Holmes enters a new phase of life alone, those years of illness no longer feel like background noise. They feel like the pressure point where everything began to shift. Holmes has never hidden his health struggles. In fact, he spoke about them often, sometimes with humor, sometimes with brutal honesty. Long before the marriage unraveled, his body was already under siege. Years of acute pain eventually led to a double hip replacement in 2016, a 3.25-hour operation after he had lived with constant discomfort for far too long. At the time, he compared the experience to live television, admitting there were nerves in the build-up, but none once it began. He even described the surreal moment when people paid him emotional tributes the night before surgery. A moment that felt eerily like saying goodbye without actually going anywhere. When he woke up, seeing a smiling surgeon, his wife, and a lunch menu brought a strange sense of relief. He joked that it confirmed he must still be alive. That humor, that instinct to perform even through pain, became a recurring theme. Then came 2018. On what should have been a joyful family milestone, Holmes was struck down by shingles on the very day of his son Declan's wedding. The virus left his face swollen, marked, and unrecognizable. Years later, during an appearance on Loose Women, he shared images of the ordeal and spoke candidly about how brutal it was. He explained how shingles lies dormant in the body for most adults and can strike without warning. Looking at the photos on screen, he compared himself to Quasimodo, acknowledging just how shocking the condition had been. But it was 2021 that marked the beginning of his most devastating decline. That spring, completely out of nowhere, Holmes developed severe back pain that refused to ease. The pain worsened rapidly, eventually leaving him reliant on a walking stick. What followed was the discovery that changed everything. 3 slipped discs, all affecting the movement of his right leg. The diagnosis explained the pain, but it didn't offer relief. By the end of that year, Holmes admitted his condition had taken a heavy toll not just on him, but on his family. He revealed that there were days he couldn't walk at all, that he couldn't bend down, couldn't manage basic tasks, and had to rely on Ruth for help. He acknowledged that his sons were embarrassed by the way he moved, and that the loss of independence was as painful as the condition itself. Scans showed the protruding discs, but even then, Holmes hoped the problem might resolve on its own. It didn't. Epidural injections offered partial relief, but not a solution. Life became increasingly restricted, and the hope that surgery would be a quick fix slowly slipped away. By the time doctors explained that other spinal and nerve issues needed to be addressed first, Holmes admitted he was crushed. He had already spent a year in severe pain and desperately wanted an answer. In September 2022, he stepped away from his GB News show to undergo vital spinal surgery. It was meant to be the turning point. Instead, it opened the door to an even harsher reality. Despite intense physiotherapy, Holmes found that his mobility remained limited. He spoke openly about how depending on others for simple tasks felt soul-destroying. Even sitting still for hours after physio sessions filled him with guilt, as though resting itself had become another burden. The surgery also left his left leg weakened, and just over 2 weeks into recovery, disaster struck. Holmes fell backwards down 18 stairs at his home in Weybridge, slamming into the stone floor below. The accident could easily have killed him. Instead, he emerged with a broken shoulder and further damage to his already weakened legs. He later admitted the fracture was a massive setback, one that forced him to take more time away from work and reset his expectations yet again. Even then, the setbacks didn't stop. A year after the surgery, Holmes underwent a spine and neck stretching procedure in September 2023, admitting openly that he still couldn't walk properly. He confessed that he couldn't run, couldn't walk, and couldn't do much of anything beyond sitting and watching television. It wasn't the recovery he had hoped for. It wasn't even close. By 2024, his focus was entirely on recovery. Daily physiotherapy became routine. A cane or wheelchair became necessary, and while Ruth continued to support him publicly, she admitted something had changed. She acknowledged that there might have to be acceptance that he would never be 100% right. She spoke about living in hope, while also recognizing how testing long-term care can be, even for the strongest families. Now, with their marriage over, those words land differently. What once sounded like resilience now feels like resignation. The call Ruth wasn't meant to hear. Inside the moment, Eamonn and Ruth's marriage collapsed. For months, the end of Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford's marriage was explained away with careful language. Health struggles, career pressures, two people drifting in different directions. It sounded reasonable, almost gentle. But behind closed doors, the real ending didn't unfold slowly or quietly. It arrived in a single, devastating moment. A moment Ruth was never meant to hear. And once she did, everything they had left simply fell apart. According to reports, the marriage ended after Ruth made what has been described as a shock discovery. Inside their Surrey home, Eamonn believed he was alone, comfortable, unobserved. While chatting on the phone, he had no idea Ruth was elsewhere in the house, but she could hear him. And what she heard wasn't harmless conversation. It was described as intimate, cozy, personal. Ruth was said to be horrified. She confronted him immediately, and the shock cut both ways. Eamonn reportedly had no idea she was even there. And by the time he found out that Ruth was there all along, the damage was already done. For Ruth, the moment landed especially hard because of everything that had come before it. Years spent standing by him through severe health struggles, surgeries, chronic pain, and loss of mobility. She had been devoted to caring for him when his body failed him. To then overhear him sharing intimate chats with another woman wasn't just painful, it felt like betrayal, a real kick in the teeth. And that moment was only the beginning. Sources say that after the phone call confrontation, the marriage didn't end straight away. It limped on, bruised, fragile, but just weeks later, Ruth reportedly made another discovery. This time, it wasn't something overheard. It was messages found on Eamonn's laptop. According to reports, that discovery changed everything. Whatever hope remained disappeared. Insiders described it as the straw that broke the camel's back. The timeline matters. The argument over the phone call reportedly happened in April. The laptop messages followed weeks later. And shortly after that, the public announcement arrived. Calm, controlled, carefully worded. A joint statement confirmed that their marriage was over and that they were in the process of divorcing. No explanation, no emotion, just a full stop at the end of 27 years together. Fans were stunned when the news broke. 14 years of marriage, nearly 3 decades as a couple, gone just like that. Not long after the separation became public, Eamonn moved on. He went public with a new relationship with Katie Alexander. Ruth, meanwhile, remained publicly single. She focused on herself, her friendships, and quietly rebuilding her life, recently marking her birthday with a girls' getaway. For a long time, Ruth said nothing. Then, finally, she spoke. In her first interview since the split, Ruth opened up about what she described as a difficult and painful breakup. She acknowledged how hard it had been to process the end of a marriage and a relationship that had spanned most of her adult life. But there was no bitterness in her words, just resolve. She explained that when a relationship breaks down, whether it's a marriage or a friendship, you reach a crossroads. You either let yourself crumble or you pick yourself up and move forward. And she chose to move forward. She admitted she wasn't delighted that her marriage was over, but she had accepted it. That acceptance, she said, was what allowed her to embrace being single again and make choices that were just about her. Not about holding something together, not about compromise, just about herself. Sharing a 22-year-old son, Jack, with Eamonn, she spoke carefully but honestly. She also addressed the added weight of going through a divorce in the public eye. Breakups are painful enough in private, she explained, but when every move is watched, commented on, and dissected, it becomes even harder. Still, she acknowledged that scrutiny comes with the job. And if you can't handle it, she said, you probably shouldn't be doing it. When asked about being on her own again, Ruth didn't pretend it was simple. She said she was fine being alone, but not forever. There's a difference, she explained, between enjoying a weekend to yourself and realizing that every weekend might now be yours alone. That reality, she said, takes adjustment, and that is exactly where the story shifts. Because while Ruth Langsford was focused on moving forward, the same moment pushed Eamonn Holmes in the opposite direction. Instead of looking ahead, he started looking back. Not with blame, not with anger, but with the kind of reflection that only shows up after everything has already fallen apart. Eamonn Holmes's regret. The one thing he says he'd change if he could go back. Almost 2 years after his marriage to Ruth Langsford came apart, Eamonn Holmes is finally looking back instead of pushing forward. And what he's admitting now doesn't sound like bitterness or blame. It sounds like something heavier. Regret. Not loud, not dramatic, just the kind that settles in when everything else has already happened, and there's no way to rewind it. In a new interview, Holmes reflected on the life he built and the one that slipped away alongside it. He admitted that if he could go back and change anything, he would try to find a better balance between his career and his personal life. Not a scandal, not a denial, just a simple sentence that says more than pages of explanation ever could. Notably, when asked about his biggest regret, the question was left unanswered, intentionally. And sometimes, what someone doesn't say carries the most weight. Eamonn and Ruth, who co-presented This Morning together for years, announced their separation in March 2024 after 14 years of marriage. Their relationship stretched back even further, beginning in the mid-1990s and producing one son, now 23. For decades, their lives were intertwined on screen and off. So when the split came, it landed as more than a breakup. It felt like the end of an era. Since then, both have moved forward, but in very different ways. Holmes began dating relationship counselor Katie Alexander, while Ruth leaned into independence. she has been open about how her fears slowly gave way to clarity. She admitted that at first, everything felt dark, overwhelming, and uncertain. But over time, the fear faded. What replaced it surprised her. Confidence, calm, even excitement. She explained that she hasn't been put off relationships or marriage, but she isn't actively searching either. The real revelation, she said, was realizing how capable she is on her own. Independent, strong, comfortable in her own space. What once felt scary now feels like an open chapter, rather than a void. While Ruth was rebuilding emotionally, Eamonn's body was continuing to betray him. Following the separation, he underwent further medical procedures, including major spinal surgery and a double hip replacement after years of severe back pain. He admitted the year had been brutal and said he would be glad to see the back of it. Publicly, he acknowledged something even harder, that he had effectively been disabled for over a year, relying on carers for basic daily tasks. He described the experience as humiliating and humbling, even as he expressed gratitude for the help he received. Ruth, meanwhile, turned inward. She began counseling after the separation and continues it to this day. She spoke about how powerful and grounding it has been, describing therapy as a space free from judgment, assumptions, or history. Someone who listens, someone who asks the right questions, someone who helps you understand why certain moments land the way they do. She admitted that even though she knows herself well, therapy has helped her process everything more calmly. Professionally, Ruth has thrived. Her career has flourished, and she has even hinted at a possible return to This Morning. When asked about presenting alongside Rylan Clark, she didn't hesitate. If they asked, she'd say yes, especially with Rylan. She described him as a TV son, someone she adores, someone she already has an easy rhythm with. The door, clearly, isn't closed. There have been lighter moments, too. During a recent Loose Women discussion about former Prime Minister David Cameron's health, fellow panelist Mylene Klass joked that men live longer when they're married, while women live longer when they're not. Ruth's reaction was quick and telling. "Good to know," she said, laughing along with the audience. It was brief, playful, but sharp enough to land. Despite everything, the connection hasn't completely vanished. Over Christmas, Eamonn reached out to Ruth, expressing continued respect and wishing her all the best. Speaking at a festive awards dinner, he said plainly that she deserved happiness. The words were simple, but the timing mattered. Even amid divorce proceedings, there was still an attempt at grace. That same Christmas, Eamonn spent the holidays with Katie, staying at a luxury cottage in North Yorkshire. He spoke openly about his hopes for the future, too. Still relying on a walking frame, he admitted mobility remains a daily challenge, but he set his sights on improvement by 2026 and is even considering pioneering stem cell treatment. The determination, at least, hasn't left him. And so this chapter ends not with closure, but with reflection. A man looking back and admitting imbalance. A woman stepping forward and discovering strength. Two lives that once ran in parallel are now moving on separate tracks. No shouting, no spectacle, just the weight of everything that can't be undone. What are your thoughts on everything that went down between Eamonn and Ruth? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.